Am I still doing my presentation today or not?
Oh yeah, Mario's got a presentation.
Wait, you want to give me one for 20 on mine?
Apparently it's about bees, moving bees. It's got some Texans in it.
Go for it.
Take it away.
All right, so I came across this article on Facebook, so I was iffy about it. I was like, it's probably fake. Then I did a little bit more research, and it was on the Bee magazine or Bee something.
Oh, it was in bee culture. Yeah, it's like a legit. I when Mario showed it to me, I thought that sounds like the most clickbaity nonsense.
So
no.
So yeah, it came out on the Bee culture, so good news, I guess. So it's pretty much it's a House Bill 4212, and that's pretty much Terry, the one that's making a bee illegal in Texas. So after 1st of January of next year, you have to have a certificate or a license in order to go out and remove a bee from somewhere. There are some requirements to that. So in order to legally remove bees, the person removing the bees has undergone through a training program, which that will be equivalent to 3 semesters at college, of 80 hours of classroom experience and 80 hours of under field training, which I'm assuming is probably going to be like some type of lab. And they need training and experiences in honeybees, beekeeping, non-lethal removal of bees from a structure, and take a comprehensive final exam, as well as have a $600,000 in insurance and $300,000 per incident plus workman's comp at the own expense, and pay like a yearly fee to be operating. So if that goes through, the department should approve one or more organizations to provide the bee removal professional training program, and they need to establish a passing score for the final exam. This act can take effect immediately if it receives a vote of 2/3 of all the members elected to each house. If the act does not receive the votes necessary immediate effect, this act takes effect January 1st. So I'm assuming either way it's gonna go in effect, right? Or from what I was looking at the votes, where they're saying the votes.
Yeah, it was a little. So did it actually get the votes? I mean, I didn't read the whole article.
I didn't. In the article, it doesn't mention, but just as it says here, so 2/3 of the members have to, I guess, go on a yes. But there's that, and we all know the importance of bees after taking this class. So imagine if that goes in effect, what's going to be the problems out there? So mostly all the people. All the house owners are just going to kill the bees or something. Like they're not going to be wanting to pay that high fee. So as we know, they're great pollinators and they provide harvest natural sugar source in form of honey. As mentioned, the damage, they're going to put small businesses owners out of business. Bee population would definitely decrease. And like I said before, the homeowners would rather kill the bees instead of paying a high fee for somebody coming in and removing them. And that's it.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, did you find anything saying why they were? Because I looked into it a little bit. I couldn't figure out why.
Just because she wants to.
Yeah.
There are some comments out there going, people talking pretty much for just because she wants to, she's just making, I guess, just trying to make everything harder. There was I guess there was like I would say like a little glitch where technically they're on somebody's property, so you can technically get your property away. So,
oh, really?
so that's probably like a little loop around.
I like to imagine that for the most part, these sorts of things have some logical reason behind them, that somebody thought it through. That may not be the case. So I was sitting there trying to figure it out. The only things I could think of was like, one, it could be that Texas and a lot of these southern states are dealing with high incidence of Africanized bees, and it's possible that they don't want a bunch of untrained people going out there and trying to catch swarms of Africanized bees, because that could get very dangerous very quickly for not just the people collecting the swarms, but people nearby. The swarms get upset. But I don't know. They never said that, and that feels like a pretty obvious explanation. The other thing I wonder is if it's a cash grab for the pest control industry.
That's what I was kind of looking towards once I was reading some of the comments.
That's kind of what I was wondering, or if it's possible that, because I mean, who are the people who have the training and the equipment to do this work under this law? It would be people in pest control, like pest removal and things like that. But I don't know. You see these sorts of things where like you have to get a license to become a hairdresser, right? You have to take like 2 years of training and things like that just to cut somebody's hair. And it's really just protection laws by the hairdressing industry to keep people out and keep the number of hairdressers low, keep salary wages high. And so I was kind of wondering if it was one of those deals. But regardless of economic stances and the like, that's not what this is about. Well, actually, we are talking about money today, so it is about money. So there we go. We're sort of talking about money today. We're talking about Hive Products. So these next 2 lectures, actually, now that I think about it, how many lectures do we have? We have like 5 left. We got these 2, we have 2 next week, and then we're meeting on Tuesday, and then it's dead days, right?
Yes. So we have next week, and then 1 day, and then dead days.
That's it? Yeah. We're like literally at the end of the semester. So welcome back to Thanksgiving break 2.0. Let's get ourselves to Christmas. So, but regardless, what we're doing these next 2 lectures is we're going to be covering the economics, and then for the last 3 lectures we're going to be covering a lot of odds and ends, just things that didn't fit in real nicely in other places. So as far as the economics of bees are concerned, I've split it up into 2 major sections, like the book does. The first of which is what we're covering today, which is hive products. So basically all the things you can collect from a beehive to sell. And then there's going to be, on Thursday, pollination services. Because pollination services don't play a huge role all over the place, but here in California they are more or less the very heart of beekeeping. Oh, I was asked to make an announcement. Dr. Avery Culbertson, the Ag Leadership Professor over in Animal Science and Ag Education, she has put together an Ag Leadership Lecture Series, and they're having Ryan Jacobson come in for the first talk. It's tonight, 6 to 7 p.m. in Ag 109, which is the big lecture room, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. You may know, you may recognize Ryan Jacobson. He's the CEO of the Farm Bureau here in Fresno, and he's the host of, what's that show called? Valley Gold, where they go around and they do like a spotlight on various agricultural commodities.
What is he going to talk about?
Leadership in agriculture. I was not given the topic of his talk, but the series is an ag leadership focus. I think it's discussion focused, so the idea is you can go and have a chance to talk with him and hear what he has to say about the ag industry. Sorry, go ahead.
Is this one of those things that we possibly do for extra credit?
No. Is he covered in bees?
Leadership.
Not talking about bees. Just announcing it in case someone's interested. All right. So, how do we make monies with bees? All right. Last week we had a question about selling bees because we had done, not last week, 2 weeks ago, we had done that talk about rearing queens. And I realized I didn't do the research into how much you can actually sell these things for. So I went out and took a look around, and note that all of my prices are based off of averages I found round and about. For any of these products, you can find them cheap, on the more inexpensive side, the more expensive side. They're all over the place. But as far as selling queens is concerned, this seems to be a major way that a lot of people end up turning a profit on bees. Mated queens, right, are kind of the highest standard that you can get for this. mated queens tend to fetch anywhere on average between $30 and $50 is what I was finding on a variety of sites and people. And then they only get more expensive depending on basically the quality. Artificially inseminated queens at the low end were about $100 each. And like Bebob mentioned last time, right? If you're going for a nice breeder queen, one that has excellent genetics and has been bred in a very intentional way, you're going to be looking at a bee that's going to cost you nearly $1,000 just for that queen. But the idea being this is a queen you keep around and you raise a whole bunch of queen cells from, and you use to basically create a whole bunch of new hives. Virgin queens, right? Those that are not mated but have emerged are going to sell for less, $12 to $20, and you can pick up queen cells relatively inexpensively. I saw those on typically between $6 and $7, given that there's not even a guarantee that you're going to get a nice healthy queen out of the cell. So relatively low risk there. And of course, some people turn a profit not just by selling queens, but by selling entire starters, essentially, like right packages and nukes. And what I was finding is that if you're purchasing packages and nukes, the price difference is almost negligible. And right, a package, right, is just like 3 pounds of shaken bees with a queen in it, whereas a nuke is several frames. And it seems like you might as well pay the extra money for the nuke. Plus, if you go down to Daydent and you look around on their board, there's a lot of people selling nukes for a lot less than $140 around here. So there are inexpensive nukes to be had here in Central California. But of course, the other major way to make money is for pollination services. Like I mentioned, we're going to talk about this a little bit later on Thursday, but I just wanted to give a really brief overview that pollination services, this is from 2016, but it's a big industry, $350 million, and this is divided amongst major regions of the US. I think approximately this is like New England, the Atlantic coast, the Midwest, right? And I imagine you can guess what 6 and 7 are. That's us. I mean, just look at that, $280 million worth of tree nut pollination. That's the vast majority of the $350 million total. So I believe regions 6 and 7 is Hawaii, California, and Arizona. So this is almost entirely California-based pollination right here. So as far as pollination services are concerned, we are definitely the outlier with, I think the next biggest one really is going to be blueberries up on the East Coast. There's a fair amount of blueberry pollination, and then apple pollination up in the Pacific Northwest. All right. But anyway, sorry.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Over the weekend, I kind of heard a conversation with this farmer. He was told to, in a 200-gallon, put about, so I'm assuming it's about 4 pounds of sugar and 4 pounds of honey, dilute it, spray on his sugar, throw it blue. And supposedly he had a pretty successful crop without the bee pollination. And supposedly there's some pollen in the honey. What are your thoughts of that? Or do you think spraying some sugar water on the flowers attracted honey from around somewhere?
I think that might have been what happened. I mean, the amount of pollen that gets into even raw honey that's been just like rough filtered is really negligible. Not enough to.
That's what I was thinking. That's why I probably just attracted honeys from.
That's what I'm thinking. You probably got some honeybees attracted in. You probably brought in some native pollinators. You might even have got a fair number of flies just coming in and checking out, and they'll all crawl all over the flowers and carry it around. They have a hard time believing that it has anything to do with the honey. But that actually brings up an interesting point, which is something that's going to come up. Today we're talking about the hive products specifically that people sell from the hives, right? That's basically honey, beeswax, pollen, propolis, and royal jelly are the big ones that people harvest and sell. And I really enjoyed researching this because there's all sorts of like semi-mystical healing with crystals, sort of stuff around bee products that a lot of people sort of, view these things as being sort of like having these sort of natural emergent qualities that make them almost like pseudo magical, mystical. and that you can do all sorts of things with all of these products. It was just really interesting to read all the things that people try to do with honey and the like, and to look into the research and see what it actually does, because some of this stuff actually is surprisingly effective at like healing and odds and ends like that. But so anyway, it was interesting to dig into, and I'm just curious to share some of it with you. So just to touch base, what is honey? And just a reminder, honey is basically just a sugar solution that is derived from nectar, right? The bees go out, they collect the nectar, and if you remember the honey ripening process, right, they take the nectar from their honey stomach, they regurgitate it into cells, they suck it in, they regurgitate it, they do a process where they blow bubbles to aerate it and to cause evaporation, and they'll fan their wings. And basically they introduce a bunch of enzymes, yeasts, bacteria, they introduce some important enzymes, and basically they convert basic nectar into a really low moisture. In the end, we only have 17 to 19% water, so very, very low moisture, high sugar content solution that is made up of really just two sugars, glucose and fructose, which are both extremely simple single molecule sugars. And there are really two enzymes that are important to this process, as best I can tell. The first one is sucrase, which is produced in the hypopharyngeal glands. And this stuff is important because it's really the enzyme class that breaks complex plant sugars down into those simple glucoses and fructoses. So the bees put this into the honey, and it goes around breaking them down. Functionally, this is what a sucrase is doing. A lot of plant sugars are relatively complex. This is sucrase. Sucrase is just a fructose and a glucose bound to one another. And the trick with these complex sugars is that when you ingest them, the body can't just readily use those sugars as they are for energy. Animals need to convert them into glucose and fructose in order to actually use them for energy in the cells. So by going through this process where basically the enzyme binds it, you add a water molecule, and then you end up with a glucose and a fructose, you create a solution where the sugar is immediately available for use by the body. So when the bees ingest this, they can get an instant sort of energy push, and they don't have to worry about going through metabolic processes to convert it, which, as we see later, makes honey sort of an ideal energy source for human athletes and things like that. The other major enzyme that's important is glucose oxidase. Now, glucose oxidase exists in very small concentrations in honey, and what it does is it goes into the honey and it finds glucose molecules after they've been broken up by the sucrase, and it combines them with free oxygen and creates two things. It creates gluconic acid, and it creates hydrogen peroxide, or H2O2. Now, why this matters is hydrogen peroxide, right? You may have seen it in your medicine cabinet, right? It's a mild antibiotic. It disrupts bacterial and fungal growth, and so this is associated with keeping honey fresh long term. And then gluconic acid is just a mild acid, but it exists in high enough concentration that it actually gives honey an overall acidic pH. pHs tend to be in the 3.5 to 4 range. And all in all, these two things, the H2O2 and the acidic pH, combine to give honey a really, really high shelf life. Who's heard the stories about the ancient Egyptians and honey, right? That's sort of a thing you hear around. That the basic idea here is that if you have nice fresh honey and you seal it up in a container so that water can't get in and you don't have an issue with humidity changes, that honey essentially has a indefinite sort of forever shelf life. And there's stories, when they opened up King Tut's tomb, what they found was a bunch of jars of stored products, right? Because the Egyptians believed that they would take the items in their tomb on with them to the afterlife, so they tried to supply them with all the important things they would need in the afterlife. And so they gave King Tut a whole bunch of honey as part of his deal. And so they opened up some of these alabaster jars that had these nice wood corks in them and were tied shut with cloth. and they found honey. And what was really impressive about the honey was that it wasn't even crystallized honey or spoiled honey or anything. Arthur Weigel was one of the researchers who was there, and this was one of the quotes that he wrote in a letter back to his wife, that when I saw this, I really nearly fainted. The extraordinary sensation of finding oneself looking at a pot of honey as liquid and sticky as the honey one eats at breakfast, and yet 3,500 years old. It was so dumbfounding that one felt as though one was mad or dreaming. He wrote a whole bunch of letters. There's a bunch of other people who did this too. But all in all, it sounds like the honey that they found was basically edible, right? And not even crystallized. They could have just sort of dipped their finger and eaten the honey. So as best I can tell, I don't know of any other foods that have shelf life comparable to that. So it raises the question, how is it that honey does have this tremendous shelf life that everybody talks about? Well, on one hand, part of it is the hydrogen peroxide we just talked about. If you have this glucose oxidase, it's going around creating hydrogen peroxide, it stays in the honey, and it's mildly antibiotic, so it's going to kill many of the things that are going to try and live in the honey. The acidity has the same effect. Most bacteria and fungi don't like high acid environments. And so if you've got this natural pH in the 3.5 to 4 range, you're not going to get a ton of activity. But the other thing that's going on here is hygroscopic nature or osmosis, right? So let's go back to like basic chemistry. Osmosis, right? What's osmosis? Anyone remember?
Water.
Yeah, it's water movement, right? So the general movement of water, right, is that if you have insoluble, if you have a bunch of soluble particles, right, and the water can move around, the water is going to try and move from areas of low concentration of soluble particles to areas of high concentrations, right? The water wants to dilute everything out evenly. And I say want, water doesn't want anything, but the tendency is water will move from areas of high concentrations to areas of low concentrations. And the basic idea here is that honey basically just has really, really low moisture. It's 17 to 19% water. It's mostly just super concentrated sugars. So if you're in a high humidity environment, honey tends to draw water in from the air. It tends to draw water from any surfaces it comes into contact with because the water wants to go in and dilute those sugars. What happens then is if bacteria come into contact with it, basically all the water that's inside the bacteria gets sucked out into the honey to try and dilute the sugar in the honey. The bacteria basically lose all their water, they can't maintain their normal functions, and they die. So basically there's just too much sugar for the bacteria to deal with. In a normal environment where you have a balance of concentration of, say, sugars inside and outside the bacteria, we just get natural flow of water back and forth. But because honey is so concentrated with sugars, the water is all going to flow out of the bacteria and starve them of that resource. This is the same way that we preserve like jellies and jams, right? That basically if you jelly a whole bunch of strawberries and you add a bunch of sugar to it, the sugar concentration in the jelly is going to be so high that bacteria can't survive in it because all the water will just get sucked right out of them.
So why does honey crystallize after a period of time?
So crystallization, a lot of crystal formation in nature, right, is just natural. It's molecules kind of snapping together into a certain form that is self-propagating. And the basic idea is that glucose and sucrose molecules can kind of do that to themselves, that if they're sitting for long enough, enough molecules will sort of snap into that formation that they'll start a self-driving crystallization process. And it really depends on how many nucleating factors you have, right? Or how many things those crystals can start building on. They usually need a solid substrate to bind to. So honeys that have, say, like high pollen content or high mineral content have little pollens or mineral ions to bind onto. They tend to crystallize quickly because the sugars will bind onto the outside of the pollen and start forming their crystals there. Whereas ultra-filtered honeys that are basically just straight up sugar tend to crystallize very slowly.
And then you decrystallize, like if you were to have a high content one, like within warm water. Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so what you're doing there is you're adding energy, and you're basically just encouraging those crystals to break apart. You're adding more energy than the bonds that hold the crystals together have. And so you just sort of break those crystals apart, they start floating again, and then as soon as you're done adding that energy, the process will start all over, but it can take years to reestablish. But some things crystallize fast, some things crystallize slow. I'm not sure why the honey in the pyramids didn't crystallize, because I imagine it was pretty raw, but it didn't.
So there's hydrogen peroxide in honey.
Very, very low concentrations, but yeah.
So why don't you feed it to infants?
You can't feed honey to infants because there are very, very low concentrations sometimes of botulinum bacteria. So these bacteria basically can't survive in the honey. They can't grow and multiply, but sometimes you get trace amounts of them. And people don't heat treat honey to any great extent because it discolors it, it changes the sugar profile, and it causes different tastes in a lot of cases. And so you do end up with some residual bacteria. And the basic idea is whatever little bit of botulinum there is in there, a normal human digestive system and immune system can handle it. But if you're talking about an infant that's younger than 1, oftentimes, not often, but there are cases where they'll ingest it and it'll sort of run wild in their body. And like I talk about in IPM, right, botulism toxin is the most potent toxin we know in the world. So even very, very small doses can be extremely dangerous. So they just don't take a chance with kids, is the basic idea. Anything else? Nope. All right. So at its heart, most of honey is just sugar and water. That's really the vast majority of it, like 97%. It's just sugar and water. But there are some residual compounds that you do find in honey. Vitamins, minerals, acids, pigments, enzymes, aroma compounds. Basically, these plants, when they produce their nectar, it's not just sugar and water. The plants are going to put sometimes scents in there to attract the bees, right? They'll put out various, like it says, vitamins, minerals, odds and ends. The bees pick this up, and a certain amount of it's going to end up in that honey, just because it is basically concentrated nectar. And consequently, this is where we get all those different varieties, right? Those smells, colors, tastes that we associate with, say, clover versus alfalfa versus orange, right? All those different honeys that we deal with, or baker's honey, those sorts of things. So just some of the common varieties that we do see, right? I'd say if you're looking at honey, a lot of the honey I see at the store is clover honey. A lot of the honey, just having tasted honeys and knowing the general flavors, most of the time I feel like when I go to a restaurant and they have honey or honey packets, it's usually clover honey or something similar to that. It's got this real mild, pleasing sort of flavor, very light coloration. Orange Blossom's another very popular variety. Orange Blossom is called Orange Blossom. It's not necessarily from oranges. It's a general term used for pollination of any citrus. So it could be oranges, lemons, limes, grapefruits, whatever. But in general, people like Orange Blossom, mostly because it has a certain amount of orange flavor and orange scent to it. So it's got a real light sort of citrusy flavor. Wildflower. So you're supposed to label where you collected your honey from, or a lot of people like to label what plants the honey came from. And the idea of wildflower is basically you don't know exactly what they were feeding on. A lot of people use wildflower as a catch-all term for, well, I had my bees sitting out in a lot somewhere and they were feeding on something. So wildflower is probably what it was. Honestly, that's probably the closest classification to what our bees are doing now, except they're mostly doing sugar water, so. But they're out there feeding on all manner of flowers. Avocado is a popular one here in California, down in Southern California. It's weird, it's almost got a sort of buttery flavor to it. It's almost sort of fatty tasting. But again, there's not really fats in it. And then alfalfa. We used to see a lot more alfalfa because it used to be that people would cut the alfalfa a little bit later in the cycle and there'd be flowers on it. But now the big thing is to cut alfalfa early, cut it early, cut it early. You don't get a lot of flowers except for in alfalfa seed production. So you don't see a ton of alfalfa honey nowadays.
What was the type of clover that the guy said when we went out to the almonds?
Bear clover? Was that the one? He was saying that
The best tasting one was like sweet clover.
he was talking about, yeah, some clover that's like not a cultivated clover, but like something up in the foothills, I think, or somewhere, or maybe it was in the north. Yeah, he was talking about some clover I hadn't heard of either.
Yeah, I think it's like somewhere in Idaho, somewhere in
North Dakota,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's what
Yeah, some sort of clover. Another honey I came across, and somebody in this class talked to me about it. Did somebody here see the Manuka honey? Maybe it was 9 p.m. class. Regardless, this is an interesting sort of niche of honey production I found called Manuka honey. It's a monofloral honey, meaning basically, right, it's just honey from one plant source. And it's this Manuka tree found in New Zealand, commonly called the tea tree. And basically, the idea is that this plant produces some interesting phenolic compounds in the nectar that get concentrated in the honey. Of particular interest is this methyl glyoxal, which is a purported antibacterial. There's a couple other phenols that are known antioxidants. And so this stuff has gotten a real reputation as being like a super health food, right? And it even has its own rating scale called the UMF, or the Unique Manuka Factor Scale. And if you find Manuka honey in a store, they'll have like +5, +10, +15, +20 on it. And that just describes the concentration of these various compounds in the honey. So on the low end, you know, like +5, that supposedly is like recreational Manuka honey, you know, if you want just a little dose of that UMF. Whereas if you're at +10, it's considered to be therapeutic. They say there's a high enough concentration of these various compounds that you're actually going to derive some health benefit. They market it for all sorts of stuff. They say you can put it on wounds and infections to treat them. They say it's good for diabetes. To be clear, they're not recommending you eat more sugar if you're diabetic. One of the symptoms of diabetes, right, is open wounds, especially on the legs and the extremities. And they're saying it's good for putting it on those wounds to help them heal. And there's some people who even say it's good for treating cholesterol and cancer. I'm generally wary of anyone who says that something as simple as honey is good for cancer. But what they do say is that it is good for treating the symptoms of chemotherapy. And so that is possible. From what I've seen, there's really limited research. This is a product that's relatively new. There is some evidence to suggest that Manuka honey is good for healing wounds. So if you were to rub it like a wet bandage on a cut or an open sore, it does help heal it faster. But there's not any evidence yet for anything else. So, you know, I don't think it would hurt to go out and to eat a little bit of Manuka honey, but at the same time, you know, don't forego any other treatments in the hope that it's going to, you know, save you. But it's also interesting, it has this really unusual color. It's sort of this real thick looking, caramel color. It's a real opaque. Oh, and this is fun. I'd never heard of this, but there's a forest or what's called flea honey, and this is made from honeydew from nectarines. So if you go to a forest, typically these are found in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. They have these areas of the forest where they just have really high scale and aphid populations. But these scales and aphids are producing honeydew, and it's dripping down through the leaves and landing on the leaves. And the bees will say, I'm not even going to go to a flower. I've got all this free sugar water hanging out on these leaves. And they'll just go around and collect all the honeydew, and they'll turn that into honey. Apparently this has a really unusual flavor, and as you can see, it's pretty dark. It's almost black in color. So it doesn't... But yeah, you can sort of see there, it's pretty dark in coloration. And so this is popular in Germany. It's gaining popularity around the world. Apparently, it's got a little bit of a honey snob vibe. So, like, if people are really into honey, they all want to get that flea honey or forest honey. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about spun or creamed honey. This is not honey from a particular source, but this is getting to the idea of crystallization. So in general, crystallization is considered bad. People don't want crystals in their honey. But like I mentioned before, crystals are formed when honey basically starts building crystals on some sort of seed structure. So the idea here is that we can intentionally crystallize honey with very, very small seed crystals, so that when the crystals form, they're not great big pretty crystals of sugar, they're going to be very small crystals that give the honey sort of a silky or buttery texture, rather than, sort of that sticky texture we usually get, or a crunchy, gritty texture. So there's a couple of ways you do this, but functionally what it is you take raw honey and you take honey crystals, and you would grind those crystals up until they're a very, very fine texture. And you would do about 1 part finely ground crystals to 10 parts honey. You would mix them together under specific temperature regimes, usually between like 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and you stir them continuously for a while, and eventually they will start to form those really fine crystals. And yeah, as you can see, it has sort of this really fine opaque color, and sort of you see it's forming like ridges and stuff that it's kind of almost more like butter. It's something you could spread on toast. Well, with that, I actually do have some honeys. If people want to try some of the different varieties.
I heard that the Asian honeybee can make hallucinogenic honey.
It's very possible. They talk about that with some of these. Let's see, what is it? Rhododendron flowers, right? That supposedly rhododendron flowers can make. Rhododendron flowers have compounds in them that can make you really sick if you eat the honey, but at low concentrations they can get kind of high, I think is the idea. Or you can make mead out of it, and the mead will have some borderline hallucinogenic effects.
In Nepal, there's the area where they actually go up and climb like hillsides and they harvest the hallucinogenic honey that talking about. But I've seen videos of that.
Yeah. Do you know what the flower is?
I don't know. I have no idea what it is.
Yeah, because I've heard of that, and I've heard of it in the terms of the Western honeybees. But anyway, if you're curious just to try this, we'll take a little bit of time here. But basically, these are all just some store-bought honeys that I have that are different sources. And what I've got is just some toothpicks. So basically what you can do is take a toothpick, dip it in, and take a taste. No double dipping, please. I understand that honey is antibacterial, and so you're probably not going to get us all sick, but I don't like to take chances. So I've got a couple varieties here. A couple of these are varieties based off of what the bees were feeding on. So we've got some orange blossom honey, right? So that's citrus honey. We've got some wildflower honey. This is nice standard sort of clover. And I didn't get you the good therapeutic stuff, but I did get some 5+ Manuka. So this was retailing for like $15. Cool. And that was down. You can buy this at like a health food store for $60. So
there's also marijuana infused honey.
I am not at all surprised.
Which is the high fructose one?
What's that one?
This is the spun honey. So this is that creamed crystallized honey. So feel free to come up, grab a toothpick. I'm going to bring the garbage can over. It really is impressive how different they taste. I'm personally partial to the orange.
You said store honey can be cut up to 50% with high fructose corn Did you say that one?
Oh, yeah. Oftentimes it can.
The cheap
Oftentimes
kind.
it is, yes. And so that's something you have to be careful about. I tried when I was sourcing these to aim for ones that I could trace. More local. I tried to trace them. I know the wildflower honey is from a collective of Northern California beekeepers.
That's where like weird accidents.
If you do the manuka, it's almost sort of medicinal. It's got like hints of eucalyptus in it. And so it's got sort of like a almost cough droppy flavor. Not usually what I'm aiming for with honey.
Better cure a lot of problems, huh?
The manuka, yeah, it's unusual. Keep taking a big dose of manuka. Pricey stuff. It is really thick though. I mean, look at that. I'll leave this last.
Kind of looks like it's fun.
All right.
Yeah. This one's clover tastes the best.
The clover?
Yeah.
I'm not huge into the clover. It's not bad.
I don't like the California one. It tastes kind of sour.
The which one?
California one.
Oh, the wildflowers.
Wildflowers.
It kind of does, doesn't it?
It has a little sour.
I'm a fan of the orange blossom. I just like that it is a little citrusy. It's got a little bit of that brightness to it.
so right now.
It's true. That's what I thought. The clover definitely tastes like the package you get at the restaurant.
Email the Shimano, see if he can add another.
I wonder if that's real money in the package for KFC.
It's like all watery over.
How much of it's cut? Someone at KFC headquarters. Water it down. They won't know the difference. All right. Everyone done? I'll just cap them, but I'll leave them out. Yeah. So you can see there's a fair bit of variety, right? Even in just this stuff. At the not the beekeeper symposium, but the short course day, they even had like avocado and some of these other varieties, and or they had different seasonal wildflower honeys. Because right, if it's wildflower and they're just foraging all over the place, you expect different profiles to your honey depending on when you harvest it, right? And so you can see, and unfortunately I don't have this because we just started our hives, but you know, I think when we start harvesting at different times of year, we're going to see a really nice sort of change in profile as the year progresses. So I'm kind of curious to see how that turns out. I'm also curious to get a little bit of that almond honey. I know it's supposed to be bitter. I'm just kind of curious to taste it. The almond? Might have to go get some. Yeah. All right. So uses of honey. So all in all, obviously people eat honey. That's sort of the big use that people chalk it up to. In the U.S., we consume a lot of honey, 430 million pounds of it per year, and consumption is way, way, way higher than production. We end up importing 2/3 to 3/4 of the honey we consume. So, you know, people don't really have any trouble moving honey. Excuse me. But what I found is that the prices seem to be relatively variable as far as honey is concerned. I was looking at the June 2018 price survey out of Bee Culture magazine, and they were suggesting that if you were to sell your honey wholesale, so if you were like a big producer and you're taking this honey, putting it in 55-gallon barrels and selling it to some, you know, somebody who's going to do all the processing and bottling for you, people are getting around $3 per pound here in California. And that's actually pretty good relative to the rest of the country. A lot of other states, if you're going to the East Coast or the Midwest, people are getting closer to $2. Some people are getting less than $2 per pound. So we get a relatively high price here. But of course, you can make a little extra money if you're willing to do the processing and sell directly to the retailers, or if you're selling yourself, right? If you're doing the processing and selling it directly off a website or at like a farm market or something like that. And it seems right now that the overall price is a little bit low. I wasn't able to suss out exactly how this works, but they were saying that in June 2018, that on average, the price was about 90 cents per pound. So I'm not sure how the average price can be 90 cents per pound, and we're making $3 per pound in California, except that they might be accounting for international sales and things like that.
So it fell that much. It fell $1.
Oh, geez. It fell $1. Thank you. See, this is the benefit of having a professional. There we go. Get rid of that too. Fell 90 cents per pound. So the prices are lowing. Lowing, that's not a word. Decreasing a little bit. This winter's supposedly been pretty rough, so I'm sure prices will bounce a little bit. Oh yeah. So, but let's talk about some uses outside of consumption. So like I mentioned earlier, right, honey is composed of fructose and glucose. And fructose and glucose are readily accessible sugars that the bodies can use immediately, so you don't have to go through any digestive process. It's immediately absorbed by the stomach and the intestines and goes out there and can be an energy source right away. So there was an interesting study by the Lancaster group, where basically they compared those little, has anybody seen those little energy packs you can buy if you do athletics, right? And the idea is if you're like a long haul cyclist or runner or something, you pull those things out and you like chug one, and it's just a little energy shot. So they compared those energy shots just to basically eating a tablespoon of honey, and they found that athletic performance was identical between those two treatments. So basically, they looked at cyclists, and they looked at the total time to perform time trials with a placebo. Dextrose is the, maltodextrose is the sugar they use in those little energy packets versus honey. And what they showed was basically that honey and dextrose statistically performed the same, which was significantly better than people who did not have a sugar treatment at all. In terms of the time to complete a time trial on their bike, the average power they produced, and their total heart rate while taking them. So this got some attention. Obviously, this is 18 years ago when this research came out. So there's actually a company that's produces a new energy gel called Honey Stinger, which is basically honey with a little bit of extra vitamins and minerals and stuff in it. But the takeaway from this was basically that you can just eat honey, and it gives you a very similar, sort of impact as these dextrose packets. And so what a lot of people do now is they make their own little homegrown packets where they use honey as the base, and they just mix in some other things with it to create their own energy gels. Wound dressing. We kind of talked about this in terms of the Manuka honey, right? That the Manuka honey supposedly has antibacterial compounds in it that make it good for wound dressing. But the reality is like we mentioned before, honey just naturally is antibiotic. It's got that hydrogen peroxide, that high sugar concentration. It's got the high acid. And all those things are bad for bacteria. But on the upside as well, honey also has some moisture to it and doesn't dry out. And so what people like about honey is it's a nice wet dressing for wounds and burns. That you can spread honey on a burn, you don't have to worry about the burn drying out, but while it's sitting there, it also wicks moisture away, so it's going to reduce inflammation, it's going to kill bacteria, it's going to seal the wounds so that bacteria from the environment can't get into it. And there's actually a lot of studies that have shown that honey is good for healing wounds. And so I've heard that before, like people say like put honey on a bee sting or put honey on a cut. I know that's like something grandmas say all the time, and it legitimately is good for some of that stuff. What people find is that the darker the honeys are, the more they tend to have antibacterial compounds in them and antioxidants, and so they're considered sort of to be the best for this sort of thing. And in general, when people use honey for honey bandages, and you can buy honey bandages, they're like these pre-packaged bandages that have honey soaked on one side. It's what they call medical grade honey, which has just been filtered ultra clean. But either way, Mullen et al. Did a study in '95 where they showed that using honey gauze versus polyurethane to do wet healing caused the wounds to heal 5 days faster. And so, there's a fair bit of evidence to suggest that honey is good for this purpose. Along those lines, honey is also good for anti-inflammatory purposes. So a big issue you have, right, is if you get like a severe burn or you get a wound or something like that, oftentimes the area of healing inflames and it swells shut or it swells so much that it can't close. And so there's a lot of effort put into reducing inflammation. And the idea is honey is pretty good at naturally reducing inflammation. It's good at wicking away white blood cells that cause the inflammation. It's good at stimulating the growth of new blood vessels in areas that have been damaged. And in general, just accelerating the healing process. Even to the extent that they've shown that honey-dressed wounds oftentimes have reduced scarring compared to traditionally dressed wounds. All right. Something else people say, right, is if you are coughing a lot, you should take some honey, right? Honey is a natural cough suppressant. There was some research by Paul et al. Looking into this where they basically compared buckwheat honey, which seems to be sort of the one that people advocate for cough suppression. They're comparing buckwheat honey to a conventional DM-based approach. And they basically showed what they said was that it suppressed coughs better than the no treatment. So it was comparable to the DM. When I was looking at the data, so what we have here is the data where basically you have the honey treatment, the DM treatment, and no treatment. And you have Likert score, which is just a measure of basically how severe the coughing is. And what they found was that there wasn't really any significant impact one night after treatment, but on the second night of treatment, they did have reduced coughing. And what I'm noticing is that there was definitely a reduction in cough symptoms from like in this case, a 3 on the scale down to a 1 in terms of cough severity. But what I'm seeing is it's not a huge difference, but definitely some relief in terms of coughing. So honey's not a bad option. And this is a big one. Who's heard that if you eat local honey, it'll help your allergies? Right? Yeah. So a lot of people talk about how eating raw honey that is locally produced is great for seasonal allergy treatment. So the basic idea being that if you're eating honey that is locally produced, it's going to have trace amounts of pollen in it from the local plants. You're going to ingest that. You're going to get basically inoculated, almost like a vaccine to the honey. To be exposed to it, it'll help you overcome your allergies. And ultimately, a lot of people do this. What I found in terms of scientific research, and this is all based on scientific research, so that's what I'm limiting myself to in terms of this class. But a lot of allergists don't think that this is something that could work or could work very well, because they point out that the amount of pollen that's in most honey is basically none, or very, very little pollen. Also, because pollen cycles so quickly and certain flowers come into season for a short period of time then disappear, and the amount of time it takes for you to go out there, collect the honey, harvest it, sell it, and ingest it, it's possible that the flowers that you're having the reaction to are already gone. And so it seems like it's unlikely that you're getting exposed to the exact pollens. There have been a few studies, only 2 that I could find looking into this. Rajan et al. Did some study in 2002 where they found there was no real impact on allergy symptoms at all, comparing doses. But Ash'ari et al. In 2013, they found that at the 8-week mark, there was a very small effect on nasal symptoms. So they basically showed that if you consumed, it was a pretty high dose of honey. It was like 1 gram of honey per kilogram of body weight. So if you're like a 200-pound male, you'd be eating about 100 grams of honey, which is, well, this is 450 grams. So you're eating about a quarter of this is your dose. So at very high doses of local honey, they showed there was a slight decrease in nasal congestion, but no decreases in any of the eye symptoms or sneezing and things like that.
You want it raw, don't you?
I think that's the idea, is you want it as raw as possible.
Yeah.
And I think both of these were with raw. But I think the idea, yeah, is that if there's anything the science suggests, it's that you do need these higher doses, and so you might need even maybe some pollen or some honey that's cut with extra pollen or something like that.
What about eating pollen cakes? People are dying from eating pollen cakes.
I don't think I'd recommend eating pollen cakes. You wouldn't die. Well, no, you might.
People have allergies, yeah, they probably like.
Yes, that is the issue. That is something that I saw over and over again on this, was the idea that if you are allergic and you consume really high doses of honey with pollen in it, you can have allergic reactions to that pollen.
So let's suppose you're allergic to bees. Can you also be allergic to the honey, perhaps, or even the
I don't think so. I think if you're allergic to bees, it's the venom, right?
Yeah, try it.
So unless the bees are doing some nefarious, venom lacing the honey, I don't think that's an issue. I don't think I've ever heard of that. Okay, so I guess this is my minor edit. Can honey help cure allergies? I'm gonna go from not quite yes to maybe, but it's unlikely, which doesn't make as good of a slogan on here. But again, right. So if I were to just sort of sum up the stuff as far as medical honey, that all in all, medical honey has kind of inhabited this realm of alternative medicine. Honey's been used for a really long time as a medicine, and when you're dealing with stuff like that, sometimes it's hard to say, was it used for a really long time because it actually has medicinal properties, or because it's sort of traditional to use it, and oftentimes this scares people away from studying it. And so there's relatively few studies looking into medical honey other than as a wound treatment, and so many of these studies are published by the same authors, and they use relatively small study designs, so it's hard to say how reputable the studies are for or against. And basically what I can say is that definitely there's evidence to suggest that honey is good for skin wounds and mild to medium severity burns, but that at the same time, a lot of people talk about honey like it's this mystical superfood that can cure everything, and it's definitely not that. I mean, it is sugar solution with some plant compounds in it. I think there probably is something to the cough suppressants and maybe even to the allergy side of things, but we just don't have hard scientific evidence to back it up. So that might be something that people figure out later. My battery's running low. Well, we're almost out of time anyway. There we go. So we'll see what happens. All right, beeswax. Beeswax is definitely one of those products that people sell. I'm not going to go into that level of detail with anything else, but honey is definitely the biggest product we talk about. So for the most part, people collect beeswax as a byproduct of the honey harvest. Like we mentioned several times before, it takes 8 pounds of honey, right, to produce 1 pound of beeswax. So most people are not super eager to give away their beeswax. They'll save beeswax comb and use it over and over and over again. But when you're harvesting, you shave those beeswax cappings off the honey, and you can melt those down and sell them. Also, you can sell burr and brace comb, and I was seeing prices all over the place. On the low end, people are selling sometimes $5 per pound if you're selling comb to like a wax candle maker. And some people market their own wax, and if you market it right and you say it's like chemical-free, ultra organic, beeswax, you can get $16 per pound at like a farmer's market or selling it off your website. As far as uses are concerned, there's a ton. Keep in mind that for a long time, beeswax was like the only really readily available wax that people had, and lots of people had beehives and were doing destruction harvest. So people, back before the 1800s, just had lots of beeswax laying around. And so it was used for like candles, making oil-based paints, basically any polish for just about anything had beeswax in it. Beeswax is also reasonably edible, and so you can use it to polish fruits, cheeses, things like that. Cosmetics are the big thing now. So if you want to market your line of beeswax mustache waxes, you can probably turn your profit. The one thing I thought was really interesting was this stuff, bone paste. So bone paste is a waxy substance they use during surgery to seal up arteries and veins, and to help the healing after surgery, and apparently beeswax is a major component of that. I only have you guys till 9:10, right? Yeah, we'll skip the wax art. Pollen. Let's talk about pollen. So we talked about harvesting pollen before. Come on, guys. 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes. Right? You can collect pollen from bees using a pollen trap, which is basically a little entrance reducer that you plug over the entrance, and you force the bees through these little holes. The idea is when they crawl through those holes, it's going to knock the pollen off their legs, and you can collect the bee breads. They're not technically bee bread at this point. But you can sell pollen for $1 to $3 per ounce. So not a bad amount of money. People like pollen. It's kind of a fad health food right now. A lot of people say that it's good for asthma, chemotherapy symptoms, allergies, all sorts of stuff. Alcoholism. It was referenced that it's good for alcoholism. I don't know how, but some people even argue that it's an athletic performance enhancer of some sort. Again, this is one where really, if there is some scientific evidence for the benefits of honey, I did not find any scientific evidence to support the bee pollen. One thing people run into is if you're allergic to certain pollen varieties, sometimes people have been shown to have allergic reactions to consuming bee pollen directly, which should not be a huge surprise. So pollen is something you need to be a little more careful about, so don't recommend eating pollen cakes. But
what's the protein count of
protein count's relatively high, depending on the pollen. I want to say it was somewhere between 35 and 70.
more than eggs?
Yeah, exactly. So it is a good pollen source. That's probably why it's an athletic performance enhancer, is that it's a good protein source.
What do you mean 30 and 70?
Pollen, protein, I believe.
What's the unit on that percent? Or?
A percentage of dry weight, I believe. It is high. Royal jelly. So this is an interesting one. You can harvest royal jelly from queen cells. And supposedly it's most potent at 3 days after grafting. So the idea is, what you would do is you would get a bunch of grafts going, right? You'd pop them in the hive, you'd let the bees start to put royal jelly in there, then you pull them out, and you use a little suction tube to suck up the royal jelly from those queen cells. And you can sell that. It takes about 125 queen cells to produce 1 ounce of royal jelly.
Wow.
And so it's a lot of work. And I saw people selling anywhere between $3 to $30 per ounce, depending on your quality and your hive health. At the same time, though, you can buy like this, a 1 kilogram jar of royal jelly. This is like somewhere between 1 and 150, right? That's a lot of royal jelly. That's definitely not following the $3 to $30 price point. It seems that there's a lot of inexpensive royal jelly coming out of China. And so I'm a little curious about how they're doing that, how they're getting so much royal jelly inexpensively. One way that this gets marketed inexpensively is this is royal jelly cut with honey. So supposedly when you consume royal jelly, it's better absorbed by the body if you eat it with honey. And so they basically combine the two for you.
He's got 100% pure fresh.
Oh, I'm sorry.
from
This
stockage.
company, Stockage,
Stockage.
they have a more inexpensive variety that is cut with honey. And I remember I was reading the reviews online, and there were a bunch of people who were saying, like, you know, this is not 100%, you know, it's cut with honey, and they're saying, well, the royal jelly in there is 100% royal jelly, but it's, yeah, cut with honey.
It's a great marketing ploy.
Exactly. But so I did find some research, a bunch of research on harvesting royal jelly from Chinese researchers. So I suspect in China, royal jelly is a traditional medicine in China, and so I imagine they've got a pretty, they've got their techniques pretty down pat for harvesting it. What I saw they were doing is they had these special queen cell holders where it was they had removable backs, so you could put larva on, pop it in, the bees would put in royal jelly, then you could pop the backs off, collect the royal jelly, pop them back in, and they'd refill it, and you could basically just do that over and over again. So I'm guessing they've got this down to like a factory science, but that's something I need to look into a bit more. But anyway, royal jelly has some use in laboratories, in cosmetics, but definitely the big use is, like I said, traditional medicine. It's listed for all of these things, all the things we were talking about.
He turned it in for our entomology.